the US-European scientific communities, which are at each other's throats, and there's a lot more dissension than would come across. But related to that, I was thinking, what about third world states, Iran, Pakistan, with its covey of brilliant nuclear scientists, this state ambition grafting onto dangerous science as a world-beating project, as a way to claim modernity. This seems very separate from the sort of picture you get by listening to you in terms of the harmony that's assumed, and also because it's about the US, it's not about non-first world nation states related to science. And connected to that as a sort of footnote, I have a old school friend, high school friend, Adam Chang from Australia, who worked in the Rockefeller University in New York and is now running a little lab on fruit flies and study of time, diurnal sequences at Oxford. And Adam used to come home and tell me the most incredible stories about these maniacs running the labs in the Rockefeller University, how they never slept, they were total tyrants. And I'm thinking about your Enough is Enough, that they were always figuring out the next huge multi-million-dollar grant. They treated their people working under them, who were often for third world society scientists earning their PhD, they treated them like terribly, and they were sort of seemed almost out of control, psychotic, insecure people who were desperate for the next grant and highly, highly competitive and highly ruthless. And I was just wondering how that fitted in. Your picture that you've got about the NSF, these really nice-sounding people who seem so considerate and worthy. So,
but clearly they both exist. The competitiveness is a matter of trying to be read. If you do an experiment and you get results and it never gets cited, then it hasn't, it's the tree that's fallen in the forest where no one is there to hear it. So you need attention. The intensity about getting grant money, notice that this is not personal wealth. The projects are expensive, the scientific machinery, and notice I never use the word technology, and I'm just subsuming technology under the word science here. If you think of science as a theory combined with a practice, so you have some kind of praxis, then you have science is expensive to do. All of the experiments that could be done with simpler, cheaper means have already been done. So particularly in physics, but also in biology, the need to, the feedback loop between expensive technology and new results is very intense. And then, I mean, I've never seen places more riven with jealousy and internal personal anger than English departments. And the science departments are just the same. So you can't expect any different. It's
tribes, I guess.
The tribalism, yeah. And within the tribes, it's like any other small town. There's a little bit of solidarity, and there's a whole lot of gossip and backstabbing. And what are you going to do? That's just the way it is. But if I'm talking about the structures of feeling created by the norms set up by these systems, and trying to discover the productive force in our society as opposed to the dominant ownership force, and saying that there is a difference between them in their mode of operation and in their field. But always there's been this warning. There's been, I mean, Galileo himself sold the telescope as a military device. It began, science began as military R&D and has always had a huge strain of that. So I am seeking out the utopian within this larger picture.
Oh, no, it's a beautiful talk, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Yes, Priscilla.
Yeah, you mentioned Leo Szilard, and put me in mind of the claim that got the idea finally for the bomb from H.G. Wells, from reading H.G. Wells, or the final understanding of some problem he was trying to solve. And I'd really love to hear you talk about fiction in relation to science, and how you understand, do you think there's a responsibility that fiction writers have, or are there, how does fiction help us think both about new innovations, or about innovations, and on the other hand about critique and responsibility?
Well, I can talk about science fiction, and the method is just extrapolation. And then I mean, you say, oh gosh, you can live underwater in a steel drum for an hour and not die. And then Jules Verne says, well, you could go around the world underneath the sea. This straight line extrapolation of a technology is a very simple technique. The problem is that history itself doesn't do straight line extrapolations, and there are plateaus and cliffs of progress and then also of falling off. And so the job of fiction is just to explore all possibilities, but to put moral values on them so that you say, in the utopian-dystopian divide, you say, if we did this, we could get to good results. Why don't we? Or if you say the warning signs, the whole Orwellian, if we do this, we are doomed. If we stay on the path we're on, we're doomed. Well, that is, to me, an easier lesson, because it seems like the course that we're on, and it's so, there's a lot of vicarious thrills to writing down the destructive one. Whereas the more that you work towards bettering society, the more that you realize how boring and tedious the work of it is. And as a fiction writer, you never want a subject that is boring and tedious in its daily activity. So there are these problems, but really fiction is there, science fiction is there to take the stance of the future. As Jerry said, you not only speak of the future, but you speak for the future. And by looking back at now from 500 years from now, the clarity, no matter if it's a fictional 500 years or not, you immediately say to yourself, oh, what idiots they were back then, or how unsophisticated. The notion that we are the most sophisticated culture ever, because we're more sophisticated than the Victorians or the early moderns, etc., immediately begin to think, well, it'll never get better than this. But it only takes a little bit of extrapolation to think that, oh, we'll be looking back at the 2010s and we'll be thinking, you know, they had just discovered the laptop and lost their minds. It's like the way people, you know, in the discovery of the telephone, for a while there was a euphoria of the telephone. Oh my God, everybody's got to call everybody. And we're in that kind of moment for perhaps the internet, but eventually you get past these technologies and we're back to just people doing things. So fiction is good for all of that stuff. I mean, in a way, science fiction is my intellectual stance or my project. And actually the idea of the project is a very good one too, because the project is very future-oriented. I have a project. What does that mean? Well, I have a notion of what I'm going to be 5 or 10 years from now. And there's a good book out of Duke University Press by a young colleague of mine at UC Davis now, Colin Milburn, called Nanovision, about nanotechnology as a project, as essentially a science fiction idea that now people are trying to enact in the real world with only limited success, but nevertheless, even if you just call it advanced chemistry, which is kind of what it is, you nevertheless have a project that has been first conceived of in science fiction and then attempt to enact it in the real world. And this may go, I mean, there are also very, very famous gaps in what science fiction predicted that they simply never saw. The personal computer is the most famous one, and there are probably several others. That looking at the situation as it is now and trying to say what's going to happen 50 years from now gets harder and harder as there's an acceleration in the pace of history and historical change. To the point where now it seems almost impossible to me, but you know, worth trying anyway. I'm very comforted by this idea that utopia is impossible, that science fiction is impossible. It really explains the feeling of my daily life. It's comforting.